So far, we learned how to use sockets in Python in order to connect two computers and transfer data between them. We wrote the code needed for this from scratch, so we wrote a code for a client or a backdoor and a code for a listener or a server, and we've seen how we can transfer data between them, and I already mentioned that this method can be used in any scenario where you need to transfer data. As an example, we built a backdoor. When installed or executed on a target computer, it allows us to execute system commands remotely on that computer. Now, when I spoke about backdoors, we said the most basic functionality is to allow the hacker to execute system commands remotely. But a lot of backdoors allow you to do much more than this. For example, they'll allow you to upload or download files, they allow you to access the file system, and so on. So, in the next lectures, I'd like to start implementing more features in our backdoor so that it's more useful. And also, as we do this, you're going to learn more about socket programming and about Python in general. But before we do that, because we're going to start implementing more features, writing more code, it'll be a good idea to convert our code, which is right now is just a simple script, into an object-oriented code that use classes. We spoke about classes before, so this will be a good revision and another example on using classes. So the first part of my program is the server or the listener, and in order to convert this to a class, we have to create a new class. So as we shown before, we have to type class to define a class, followed by the class name, and this is going to be our listener, so we're going to call it listener. Note the capital L at the start of the word. This is a convention when you're writing programs in Python to capitalize the first letter in the name of the class. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a constructor. So this is a method that gets executed as soon as the class is created. So it's something that initializes the class. So to create a constructor, we do def __ init, and that's going to take self, and then we implement the code that's going to be executed in this method. Now, I want to establish a connection and listening on a specific port whenever the object is created. So I want this to be executed automatically whenever the listener object is created. And therefore, I'm going to copy all of this code that we usually execute at the start of our script. We're going to put it in here. Now, looking at the code, you can see that this takes two variables. It takes the port and the IP to listen to. So I'm going to add two arguments to my constructor, which are IP and port, and I'm going to use them in here. This will allow the user to use different IPs and different ports whenever they create the listener object. Now, another thing that we need to keep track of is the connection. Now you can see that this variable right here gets used later on in our program. So I'm going to convert this to an attribute of my object by saying self.connection is going to be equal to the first value returned by the listener.accept. By doing so, I'll be able to access the self.connection from anywhere within my code as long as that code is part of the class. So this means that we need to include all of this code, which is the code that takes a user input, sends it to the backdoor and get the result and print it. This needs to be part of the class now in order to be able to access the connection attribute. So I'm going to cut it. I'm going to create a method here, and we'll call this method run. And in here, I'm just going to paste all of my code. And whenever I use the connection variable, now we're going to call it self.connection. And same here. We're doing this so that anytime we're trying to use the connection object, we're actually using the attribute of our class, of our listener class. Now, I'd also like to put this code right here, which is the code that sends the command and receives the result, into a method. So I'm going to cut this and I'm going to create a method here. I'm going to call this execute remotely. And this will take a command. And in here, we're going to send the command through our connection. And we're going to return whatever we receive. And in here, in our run method, we're going to say the result is going to be equal to myself.execute remotely. And this is going to pass the command. This way, every time I need to implement a new command, I'm going to start implementing them and processing them in here. So now I think the code is very neat. It's using a class, and we are able to forget about how this class works and only remember the methods to use the class. Now you can import this listener class in a different file and use it from that file, just like I showed you when we converted our keylogger code to use classes. Alternatively, you can actually create an instance of this class and use it within this file. So I'm just going to show you this in here as an example, but using the class from a separate file is actually better. Now, in order to create an instance of this class, as usual, we're going to create a variable and we'll call it myListener. And this is going to be equal to listener. We'll have to pass it the IP, which is 10.0.2.16. This is the IP of the local machine, followed by the port to listen on. And then to run this class, we're going to say myListener.run. And that's it. Now let's go ahead and test this and make sure that our listener still works as expected and we didn't break anything. So if I do python listener.py and go to my Windows machine and run the backdoor, as you can see, we get a connection, so that's perfect. Now let's try to execute some commands. So let's do dir. That's perfect. We're getting the result. Let's do another command. And this is working as expected. So right now we didn't really add any functionality to our backdoor or to our listener, but we converted the code into a much neater code. This will allow us to easily extend this code and add more features as we go along the course.